Well, hello everyone. I am unable to be in class today, but there's a couple things I want just to make sure that you are aware of. They fit in nicely with the whole theme of Democratic Republicans against Federalists. So I'm just going to cover two slides here that sort of tell the story, and if you can't quite see, that's okay. This is about something called the Whiskey Rebellion, which was the first major attempt to threaten the U.S. government by Americans. The previous rebellion that we had covered was called Shays Rebellion, but remember that was only a rebellion against the state of Massachusetts, which revealed the weaknesses of the federal government because the federal government felt it didn't have the authority to respond to Shays Rebellion. Now this is after the new Constitution has been written, and so let's see how the federal government handles this rebellion. It starts off with the creation in the upper left there, you can kind of see it, the creation of the whiskey tax. So Alexander Hamilton believed, we talked in class Monday about something called the elastic clause, and Hamilton believed in it. Hamilton believed that the elastic clause in the Constitution gave the federal government the authority to tax. So he argues that the United States government should tax whiskey. And so an excise tax is a tax on a specific product, and so they taxed this product called whiskey. But there were people in the U.S., regular farmers, regular folks, who believed that this was simply another example of the elite out east, in this case, the national government, taxing unfairly a product that they made themselves. Why should they have to pay the federal government for a product that they made on their own land? And so we have people in Western Pennsylvania rebelling against the attempt to collect this tax. And they saw it as simply the same thing that the British were doing against the Americans before the Revolution. And so here I am synthesizing. People out west, Western Pennsylvania, being resentful of people out east, in this case, Washington, D.C., taxing them just like the American colonists, people out west, resenting a tax from people out east, in that case, the British. And so these people saw themselves as the real Americans being resistant against the oppressive government forces. And once again, what we had was people tarring and feathering tax collectors. It's a major rebellion. It says here it's the first major threat to the national government. What is George Washington going to do? You have Americans rebelling against tax collection, which Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, argued that the federal government needed to have that authority and that any sort of attempt at rebellion needed to be crushed like a grape. And here he is, there's Alexander Hamilton talking to George Washington, saying that the federal treasury, the amount of money that the federal government had, was dangerously low, and that the excise tax on whiskey was a way of raising revenue. And that if these people did not pay the tax, that this was a dangerous precedent, that states could ignore national laws, or that people could ignore national laws. And so it's a huge test for the government. And the question I have here is, who has sovereignty? In other words, who rules over these people? Can they ignore a federal law just because they want to? Similar to what Jefferson recommended about the Sedition Act, something we will cover later on, but something that was in a couple of your documents. If a state feels like a law is dumb, should the state be able to ignore it? If an individual thinks a law is dumb, should the individual be able to ignore it? In this case, it's a tax on whiskey. Some people felt it was a dumb tax. Should they be able to ignore it? Similar to Rosa Parks ignoring a law that was in place. So she ignored it. She ignored a law that she thought was a dumb law. But does that create a nation of chaos? What ended up happening is that George Washington raised an army and he went and marched to Western Pennsylvania, and he did put down the rebellion. It ended up not being violent at all. They immediately surrendered, and frankly, most of them, not even sure, maybe all of them, all of the rebels were pardoned. And so he thinks, George Washington believes, yep, the question has been settled. No longer can states ignore federal laws. People cannot rebel against taxes. He believes that the question has been settled forever. And of course, it hasn't. It goes right up to the present day. One other thing about this page, Congress passed a law called the Force Act. The Force Act gave the federal government the authority to use the military against rebellion. Of course, the military is used against foreign enemies, but now the military can be used against domestic rebellions, which is, of course, what Shays' Rebellion was, and the Articles of Confederation did not grant the authority to the federal government to handle rebellion. Well, now the federal government can handle the rebellion. This slide represents a victory for Hamilton's point of view, that the federal government has authority, that the federal government can handle rebellion, that the federal government can tax. It represents a defeat, I suppose, for the Jeffersonian point of view, that no, states are primary and that the federal government should be weak. Last slide for today. What we had was the emergence of two political parties, two opposing parties. On the left slide here, it says financial success at the expense of states' rights. And it says here that the federal government would assume state debts, that means take over state debts, that the federal government had the right to tax whiskey, that's an excise tax, that the federal government had the right to create a national bank, and that the federal government had the right to squash rebellion. This is an increase in federal power at the expense of the power of states. This is the Hamiltonian point of view. This slide, the column on the left represents the different points of views of the Democratic Republicans versus the Federalists. The assumption of state debts. Well, the Federalists said that's what should happen. The federal government should pay off state debts. The Democratic Republicans said that's a dumb idea, that this would encourage irresponsible state spending. If the federal government was going to pay off all the state debts, then what's to stop a state from spending all it wants, knowing that it didn't have to pay those debts back? The federal government would take care of it. So Democratic Republicans thought assumption of state debts was kind of dumb. The excise tax, well, the Federalists said this is a good idea. It's a way of collecting revenue, paying off debts. And the Democratic Republicans say it's a bad idea. It's no different than the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and all those other taxes that the British attempted to collect. The federal government created a national bank. Well, the Federalists said this is good. This is a way for the federal government to handle financial matters, collect taxes, deposit them, spend money. Democratic Republicans said that the national bank was a dangerous idea because whoever controls wealth controls power. And so a national bank, which is in the hands of the federal government, means the federal government's in power. And once again, this would mean states were secondary to the power of the federal government. And finally, the French Revolution. The French overthrew their king. They looked at what the U.S. was and said, we want that. The Federalists opposed American support of the French Revolution because they said it's chaos. It's a mob mentality. That it's dangerous to allow the sheep to run the farm or the cows to run the farm. They don't know what they're doing. Remember, the federal government was run by the U.S. Constitution, which put into place mechanisms to prevent the mob from ruling. We had talked about that last week. All sorts of examples where the will of the majority was put into check by checks and balances and the Electoral College, et cetera, so that the will of the majority is not always honored in the U.S. But in France, that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted pure democracy, and so they decapitated their king, and the Federalists said we should oppose that. Whereas Jefferson said, no, that's good. We should support the French in their efforts to be like us. Here's a picture of King Louis losing his head. last bit of note taking here. In the French Revolution, the British and the Austrians invaded France because what they said was, my God, if the people of France overthrow their king, what's going to happen to our king? Well, we can't let that happen. So the British invaded France. This is really weird, to put back into place the French monarchy. It's weird because, of course, Britain and France had fought for hundreds of years. And so here are the British putting back into place the French monarchy. And the fact that the British were now invading France meant that there might be fighting over in the Caribbean because the French did have a few colonies. And since the British had invaded France, it was possible that the British would also advance on French islands in the Caribbean. All right, everyone, thank you.